The rise and fall of nations is directly proportional to commercial and military superiority at sea. A strong navy creates a strong deterrent and brings both military and economic power to the next level. Undoubtedly, the U.S. Navy is considered to be the strongest navy, followed by the Russian Navy. For this reason, countries with great navy power have historically transformed naval power and its elements into a common foreign policy tool with strategic gains. However, Russia's attempt to invade Ukraine has begun to undermine this policy. With Vladimir Putin's initiation of the invasion of Ukraine, his drifting into isolation in the political arena took place at lightning speed. Left alone in the political arena, Vladimir Putin had to grapple with a series of sanctions. The most crucial of the sanctions imposed on Russia focused on breaking Russia's power in the seas. Heavy sanctions, especially in the defense industry and trade, have begun to show their long-term impact on the Russian Navy. Russia is beginning to feel the effects of the sanctions most heavily in the maritime field. The sanctions are hitting Russian shipyards, navy, spare parts, the Russian maritime military industry, and the Russian international civil trade network. The fact that Russia can no longer produce ships gives Putin the effect of a cold shower. If you remember, the Russian Navy could not renew their first aircraft carrier, Admiral Kuznetsov, due to the sanctions, and the ship is still unusable. In addition, Russia has faced many difficulties as it has not been able to renew its old ships and submarines in the last 15 months. Engine parts and weapons systems are very important for shipbuilding. For the past 3 decades, the Russian Federation has become too dependent on the West for technology. There was no problem in the state of peace, but the sanctions imposed in the last 15 months have devastated the Russian Navy, which is dependent on cutting-edge semiconductors and chips, as well as special spare parts. According to recent reports, Russian shipbuilding giant United Shipbuilding Corp is running out of key engine parts. This delays or halts production of the tankers and ocean liners that the country needs to transport its oil and cargo. Shortly after Russia launched war on Ukraine, the United States and Europe slapped Russia with sanctions and export controls that interrupted the flow of engine parts, propellers, and fuel pumps. While the European Union and the USA banned Russian ships in their ports, they also imposed sanctions on tankers carrying Russian oil. These actions have led Russian oil exporters to rely on an aging tanker fleet that now carries most of the country's oil exports by sea. A U.S. official stated that the state-owned United Shipbuilding has been sanctioned since 2014. However, the U.S. official stated that the difficulties of equipment and foreign specialists in assembling parts became systemic after February 2022. USC is in the process of building 59 cargo ships. It delivered 17 ships in 2020 and 16 in 2021. But according to people familiar with the order, only 4 cargo ships were built last year as the rudder propellers made in Germany were no longer supplied. USC declined to comment on its orders or deliveries. Also, USC and other state-owned enterprise, Zvezda Shipbuilding Complex, are Russia's 2 largest shipyards in terms of orders. These shipyards build a range of ships from nuclear-powered submarines and Navy frigates to icebreaker tankers and cruise ships. The clients of these shipyards are mostly from within Russia, and the production problems will be felt mostly within the country. Any issue will have a limited impact on global shipbuilding dominated by Asian shipyards. With a global order book, a regular customer of both Russian shipyards is the state-owned tanker operator Sovcomflot, which was also sanctioned and forced to sell more than a third of its fleet and relocate its operations to Dubai. Investments consultant Infoline in Russia stated that local shipyards delivered 20% fewer ships last year than in 2021. Tonnage increased slightly as Zvezda delivered 2 large tankers to another state-owned tanker owner, Plot and Rosneftplot. On the other hand, Russian shipping executives say that shipyards are trying to make some of the missing parts themselves or replace them with imports from China. But Russian shipping executives say building new supply chains and shipbuilding takes time and increases costs. Shipyards are lobbying the Kremlin for support and subsidies, such as the abolition of tax fees and penalties for missed delivery dates. Zvezda has signed contracts to deliver more than 50 vessels this year. Components of these ships were secured before sanctions were imposed, but putting them together was a shared task with Korean partners, according to people involved. This business has been stopped due to sanctions. A manager at Zvezda's factory in Bolshoikamen stated that the lack of imported engines hindered production at the factory. The manager stated that it will take several years for some of these parts to be produced in Russia. Zvezda did not respond to requests for comment. Civil shipyards received $6 in government support this year. However, executives say import substitution prospects are weak. Some executives say the Russian shipbuilding industry is facing its biggest challenge since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Managers expect thousands of jobs to disappear in the next year in shipyards and supporting manufacturers. Russian Deputy Prime Minister Denis Manturov stated earlier this year that USC and the Ministry of Industry and Trade will collaborate to produce large marine engines locally. The Ministry of Industry and Trade of Russia reported that it will pump more than $1 billion over the next 2 years for the development of the engine building. In another development, the U.S. is imposing new sanctions on Russia and Iran for holding Americans hostage because the United States is working to prevent further captivity and potentially secure the release of citizens currently detained. The move came amid several high-profile cases in which Americans were wrongfully detained. Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and ex-Marine Paul Whelan are being held in Russia on espionage charges, which they vehemently deny. American citizens Sy Amak Namazi, Imad Sharji and Morad Taybaz are being held in Iran's notorious Evin prison. The last sanctions will punish organizations the United States accuses of being responsible for holding Americans hostage or wrongfully detaining them. Officials stressed that the steps should serve as a warning to those considering taking Americans hostage. A senior management official said, "We also show that you can't engage in this kind of horrific behavior that uses people as pawns, bargaining chips without paying the consequences. And these are some of the consequences." However, questions remain about the real impact of these sanctions, because most of the organization is hit by the latest sanctions were already sanctioned by different authorities by the USA. The latest sanctions were the first steps taken in connection with an executive order Biden signed 9 months ago. The executive order aims to punish organizations or criminals responsible for holding Americans captive. The executive order mandated better flow of information to the families of Americans held hostage or detained overseas. Since then, the administration has secured the release of large numbers of Americans held overseas, including American basketball player Brittany Griner from Russia and 7 other Americans imprisoned in Venezuela. But several high-profile cases remain unresolved. Officials said the recent sanctions were only part of the overall strategy to prevent Americans being taken hostage and extradite those currently in custody. In carrying out these actions, the U.S. government must be careful not to put any more obstacles in the way of removing unjustly imprisoned Americans. Officials said the sanctions could be lifted if Americans held in Russia or Iran are released. It seems that 2021 was the best 8 years in terms of tonnage for Russian naval shipbuilding, reaching 80,000 tons, up 15%. In general, the Russian Navy was replenished with 7 large warships, 4 surface ships and 3 submarines. In addition, the fleet received 17 support ships and boats, 10 combat boats and 3 Bastion coastal missile systems. If 2021 was a good year, 2022 was a disappointment. The nights when almost no new builds were commissioned due to the crisis in Navy shipbuilding were the worst performances in the first decade. 2023 will likely see another decline in the number of ships and vessels delivered. It would be an exaggeration to say that 2024 is the edge of a cliff for Russian shipbuilding. However, this will reveal the extent to which the industry has managed to begin its journey of survival under the new and tougher sanctions regime. Tanks are indispensable war machines for an army. The Ukrainian army absolutely needs powerful tanks to withstand offensive operations or enemy spring attacks. The Ukrainian army has Soviet-era T-72 tanks. Bradley and Stryker combat vehicles will be sent from the USA and Challenger, 2 tanks from the UK. But Ukraine, which wants to wipe out Russian tanks from the front lines, needs more effective tanks. Here, 2 Leopard 2 tanks come into play. Therefore, it would not be wrong to describe Leopard 2s as force multipliers. A country draws all the attention in the shipment of these tanks, which we describe as force multipliers. Despite the prudent stance of the Western states neighboring Poland, which made a bold move to transport tanks to Ukraine, could change the course of the war. The place of Poland, Ukraine's most staunch supporter, both in Europe and in the world, has changed. The heart of Europe now beats in Warsaw, as it is known. Poland formed a tank coalition shortly after the war started. With the participation of various countries, the coalition expanded and support for Ukraine increased. Now, some of the 14 Leopard 2 tanks that Poland promised to Ukraine are about to reach the territory of Kiev. Poland became the first Western ally to transfer modern Leopard tanks to Ukraine. Ukraine took delivery of the remaining 10 of the 14 Leopard 2 tanks promised by Poland after Ukrainian soldiers completed their training to operate this equipment. Also, in addition to 14 Polish Leopard tanks, this battalion includes 4 tanks from Canada, 8 from Norway, and 6 from Spain. 14 Leopard 2 tanks delivered from Poland to the Ukrainian armed forces arrived in Bakhmut and began to take an active part in the defense tasks of the Ukrainian armed forces. Ukrainian military personnel completed their training on Leopard 2 tanks in Poland. All Polish tanks at Warsaw plans to send to Kiev are now in Ukraine. As a reminder, the first 4 of the 14 Leopard 2 tanks were delivered to Ukraine by Poland on February the 24th, the anniversary of the large-scale invasion by Russia. Warsaw will also provide 60 PT-91 Twardy tanks. Of course, Poland's place in this war is not limited to the Leopard 2 tanks. Let's dive into the relations between Poland, Ukraine, and other Western allies that have developed since the first moment of the war. As a frontline state, Poland has played a crucial role since Russia began massing troops on the Ukrainian border in preparation for the invasion. Due to its geographical location bordering both Ukraine and Belarus, Poland has become an important route for Western supplies to Ukraine and a safe haven for Ukrainian refugees. On February 24, 2022, when Russian tanks entered Ukraine, neighboring Poland opened its borders to millions of Ukrainians who had fled their country, and ordinary Poles lined up to welcome refugees at their homes. Like the Baltic states, Poland has quickly become a major defender of Ukraine's cause within the EU and NATO, sending large quantities of weapons. Poland's size, location, and infrastructure make it the West's most important gateway to Ukraine. That is why Poland has become the main transit country for international aid. In addition, Poland led lobbying efforts to impose harsh sanctions against Russia and support Ukraine with strong political, economic, and military assistance. It donated major military aid to Ukraine, including the main channel of military supply and 300 tanks from its own stockpiles. Polish leaders were among the first to arrive in Kiev as artillery still bombarded the city, and the country supports Ukraine's early accession to the European Union. Poland, on the other hand, is a NATO state that is in a vulnerable position in the Ukraine war, which partly explains why it has been so proactive in providing military support to Ukraine. Poland is closer to the center of the storm than any other NATO member. There is a risk of further immersion. For this reason, Poland is forcing its other allies to do more. On November the 15th, 2022, after multiple Russian missile attacks on Ukraine and its energy infrastructure, a missile hit an area in southeastern Poland, killing 2 people. This event showed the potential risks Poland faces. In response to this event, the German government offered to supply Poland with Patriot air defense systems. but Polish Defense Minister Mariusz Błaszczak suggested that these systems be supplied to Ukraine. The German government agreed to consult within the alliance, accompanying the arrival of Patriot systems for Poland and Ukraine. Several hundred German soldiers will be stationed in Poland. About 90 to 100 Ukrainian soldiers are expected to be trained by the Polish-based Germans to operate a Patriot battery for Poland. The best way to prevent escalation is to provide Ukraine with the means to defeat Russian aggression. Contrary to the rather restrained language of the U.S. administration, the Polish government, quite bluntly, states imperialism must be stopped and defeated. Otherwise, it will be a constant threat to the free world. Also in January 2022, Poland announced that it would provide arms, ammunition, and humanitarian aid to Ukraine and has since provided aid worth $3 billion. On February 17, 2022, a Polish-British-Ukrainian trilateral agreement was announced to improve cybersecurity and cooperate on energy security. As the military conflict developed, Poland became the second-largest arms supplier to Ukraine, sending missiles, drones, tanks, and other military supplies, and as a major route to arms supplies from the United States and other NATO countries. Poland was even ready to send MiG-29 fighter jets, although not approved by the United States. In another development, Germany and the USA made the headlines in recent months by deciding to send tanks to Ukraine. However, the unsung hero behind this landmark decision was actually Poland. Polish leaders were particularly instrumental in their efforts to persuade Berlin of the need to supply Ukraine with modern tanks. This was the latest example of Polish leadership. Poland's leading role in the European response to Putin's invasion reflects the country's extensive experience of Russian imperialism in both its Tsarist and Soviet forms. Since Poland's accession to the European Union in 2004, politicians in Warsaw have been warning Europe of the growing threat posed by resurgent and revisionist Russia. Moreover, Poland's prominent role in European security policy today is not entirely new. Since joining NATO in 1999, Poland has become a security element on the alliance's eastern flank. This was made possible thanks to Poland's strategic location and its extraordinary economic growth, which helped finance the rapid modernization and expansion of the country's armed forces. The Polish army is currently ranked as the 20th most powerful army in the world. Poland has in many ways set the standard for European humanitarian intervention in the Russian offensive against Ukraine since the invasion began. Poland has accepted more Ukrainian refugees than any other European country, while also providing a range of benefits such as access to health and education as well as employment opportunities. Poland is also one of the leading contributors of military aid to Ukraine at per capita rates. Poland sent more military aid to Ukraine than almost any other country except the Baltic states. In fact, it is possible to summarize Poland's point of view towards Ukraine in one sentence, and we can make this summary with the words of the Polish Prime Minister. Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki stated that he would do all kinds of material and moral assistance by saying, "We will not just watch Ukraine's bleeding." Spring season is coming, the weather is getting warmer, the Ukrainian front lines are softening, and most importantly, a new phase of the conflict begins. Ukraine must completely clear the Russian troops on the front lines, both for its own independence and for neighboring countries. It is very important for Poland that Ukraine defeats Russian aggression. Otherwise, the security of Europe as a whole and Poland in particular will be at risk. A lot of news is coming from the south. Here are the Ukrainians launched a series of precision strikes that successfully exploited the movement of Russian forces away from the close proximity to the front. The Ukrainians took out several Russian air defense systems and then hit 3 Russian bases in this unprotected area and also a huge column with dozens of pieces of equipment and soldiers. Last time we talked about this region, I told you that the Ukrainians had concentrated their fire on the bases that are closer to the front line. In this first phase of heavy fire, the Ukrainians destroyed Russian equipment and concentrations of manpower in the vicinity of Kakhovka-Nova, Kakhovka, Oleshki, Rudnik, and Skadovsk. I also told you that as a result of this fire, the Russians started moving and relocating their forces closer to Crimea and Melitopol, and that this would be the next logical target for the Ukrainians. And this is exactly what happened today. The first target of the Ukrainian precision strike became Kalankik. Here the Ukrainians have reportedly struck a number of Russian air defense systems, either S-300 or S-400. The successful destruction of Russian air defense systems gave more flexibility in the sky, which is when the Ukrainians launched the second wave of rocket attacks. The second target became a Russian base in Skadovsk. Here the Russians have the main headquarters for launching Iranian drones in southern Ukraine. Ukrainian intelligence reported that these facilities are used both for training as well as participating in the massive missile and drone strikes on Ukraine. Today's strike indicates that these facilities have been damaged. The third target became a Russian base in Chaplinka. Chaplinka has a famous airfield that the Russians used to conduct rapid air strikes on Ukrainian attack units during the battle for Kherson. Over the last several months, this airfield was used for conducting airstrikes on the Ukrainian positions along the river, in particular here in Zolota, Balka, and Dushin. So far, there are no details as to what exactly was targeted on this airfield, but judging by the previous reports and satellite footage, the Russians kept there a few helicopters. The next strike targeted a Russian base in Armyansk, which is already Crimea. Armyansk is the town that basically connects Kherson and Crimea, so it is an important logistical hub where the Russians had a pretty big base, especially with ammunition. At first, the occupation authorities reported that the explosions were caused by air defense, but when photos emerged of a huge cloud of smoke, Russian sources corrected themselves and said that Russian soldiers were undergoing training in that region. Ukrainian sources reported that it was a successful hit on an ammunition depot. The last strike happened in the Zaporizhia region. Here the Ukrainians caught a huge Russian column that was moving from Vasilivka towards Melitopol. Some sources speculate that the final destination of this column was Volodyarka because the Russians incurred extensive losses in that region over the last several weeks and were in dire need of reinforcement. Unfortunately for the Russians, their old practices of using columns continue costing them manpower and equipment. As this column never reached its destination, overall, the Ukrainian Air Force had a very productive day, and according to the yet unconfirmed reports, this region facilities in Skadovsk, air defense systems in Kalankik, helicopters in Chaplinka, an ammunition depot in Armyansk, and a column near Vasilivka which resulted in losses of armor as well as manpower.